Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. In today's show, we talk elk. Historically, elk were found throughout Wisconsin, but were overhunted and driven out of the state as it became more developed in the late 1800s. In the mid-1990s, researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point brought a small group of them back to Clam Lake, Wisconsin. Since then, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has taken over management responsibility for the herd and expanded it in the state. To learn more about the ongoing project to bring the big game animal back to Wisconsin, I talked with Kevin Wallenfang, a deer and elk ecologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. What's kind of the state of the elk population in North America? Where are they found and how is the population generally right now?
Well, let's see. On a North American basis, elk are primarily considered a Western species. Their populations, vary. They fluctuate just like, say, our deer populations do back here. So, in some areas they're up and some areas they're down. But elk are generally considered a fairly abundant critter, especially in the West. And, there are hunting seasons in most of the Western states or all of the Western states. And then we start getting over, into the eastern part of the United States where there are a number of elk reintroduction efforts that have occurred over the years, starting, way back when. Wisconsin's even goes back to the early part of the 19th century. I guess that'd be the 20th century, but into the early 1900s, a number of states started reintroducing elk back then: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Wisconsin's animals did not take, but then through the 1990s and into the 2000s, additional states have jumped on that bandwagon. So in the eastern part of the country, probably the biggest population exists in Kentucky, but then you've got states, in that neighborhood, the Carolinas, Arkansas, Tennessee, the Virginias, and a few others have started reintroducing elk. In Wisconsin, we started ours in the mid-1990s. And there are additional states still looking at reintroducing elk, and Minnesota is one of them, just off the western border of Wisconsin. So elk, they're a big deer. They're very adaptable, and they do well in a variety of environments. So elk are these days really considered a mountain species because that's kind of where they were pushed. But historically, elk were a prairie critter. The historic documents have talked about elk in large numbers right out among buffalo and antelope and things like that. So highly adaptable to lots of different kind of environments, and they're doing quite well across the country.
And what's kind of the state of the population in Wisconsin?
Well, Wisconsin has two separate herds, and the first of those was reintroduced in the Clam Lake area in 1995. And over the years, that population has grown. Most years, we've seen herd growth, and it currently sits at about 165 animals. Of course, that's going to change, once we have calf drop in the springtime. But then our second population was just reintroduced a couple of years ago down in Jackson County. That, too, is part of the historic range of elk in Wisconsin, and that population is currently in the neighborhood of about 60 to 65 animals.
And for the majority of people who probably haven't run into an elk in the wild, can you explain their size in relation to the common deer that we're kind of used to in Wisconsin?
Yeah, they're considerably bigger. You'd certainly probably know it if you saw one. Their body color, for starters, is different. So if you don't have a size perspective, you're really looking at a very, in the wintertime, fairly dark brown animal. The bulls will also have a mane that gets, fairly black in color. In the summertime, you're looking at, a very tan animal. They've got a very distinct white rump patch. So unlike a white-tailed deer where their tail covers a good portion of it, an elk, you'll just see that white patch as kind of one big round circle. Obviously, size-wise, with a big mature bull elk, you might be looking at something in the neighborhood of 800 pounds, where, our biggest of white-tailed deer in the state are usually going to be topping out somewhere around 300 pounds. So at least double, if not triple the size of your average deer. A cow elk is going to be around 600 pounds or so live weight. Long, thin neck, fairly similar to a deer, but, if you see a bull in the fall, you're likely to see an extremely large brown set of antlers on top of its head. The cows, just like our white-tailed deer, do not carry antlers. But, one of the real exciting, distinctive things about elk that, to me, is one of the true sounds of the wilderness is the bugle that they make. And you hear that high-pitched scream. You can hear it for miles. And, if you get up into the Clam Lake or Jackson County area in September and early October, you can hear that on a regular basis. So it's exciting to have them out there. People coming from distance, spending money in the area, wanting to have a look at those animals. People go out in the woods, they try to mimic that sound and try to call elk in. They come to a call fairly readily, unlike our white-tailed deer can do the same thing, but elk are neat because you can hear them from so far off and move in and try to get close to them and try to get a look at them. So it's pretty exciting.
So do you have any tips for people who are going out looking for elk or want to see them, want to get a picture of them, other than calling them? How do you find them? Do you have any tips for people?
Calling is the best way to find them, actually. So, in lots of areas, you can just kind of get out in the central part of their range. And, any place you go, if you talk to locals up there, they're going to have a good idea of where the elk are. They see them regularly. And, get out there early in the morning or late in the evening and just listen to those bugles. Sometimes you can pretty much drive down the road. They're not hunted in Wisconsin at this point. So, they don't have a lot to be afraid of, and you might see them actually, feeding in open areas or in ditches or whatever it may be along the highway as they are looking for something to eat. Grasses are a big attraction for them, so obviously ditches and fields are going to be an attraction for them. But, starting with sound is always a good place to begin. But beyond that, in the wintertime, they use clear cuts a lot. Like our deer, they kind of rely on that new growth that clear cuts have in abundance. And then, during the daytime, they're usually laying down, especially when it's real cold, they'll be laying kind of under conifers and that kind of thing, so taking advantage of the thermal cover. They're like any other animal. They're not usually just out standing around in the middle of the day. And unless it's the rut, just like our white-tailed deer, they get more active during the daytime, and you might hear them bugling pretty much at any time of the day or see them moving at any time of the day. But they do, they also rut differently than our white-tailed deer do. Typically, when you see a white-tailed deer here, it's one buck with one doe. Elk they create harems. They form harems, so one bull could have 10, 15, 20 cows with him. So you're likely, when you do see them, you're going to see quite a number of them at a time.
Why reintroduce elk in Wisconsin? What's the reason that we're doing this?
Well, I think probably one of the greatest reasons to reintroduce any kind of a species is to right a wrong. And elk were once native on the landscape. At least 50 counties of Wisconsin's 72 counties have historic records, either written documents or bone fragments or antler fragments or whatever, of having elk out there. So, over a period of time, through habitat loss and coming of settlers to the area and unregulated hunting, those animals disappeared. And, Wisconsin is perhaps one of the greatest states in the country, considering our history and heritage and whatever you want to call it, as far as folks like Aldo Leopold and John Muir and other, environmental oriented people. We have this conservation history that is extremely strong in Wisconsin. We have this history of wanting to do this in Wisconsin. And, back in the 1980s, there was kind of a movement that took place among some legislators to look at the possibility of bringing some of these animals back, and the Department of Natural Resources was asked to do an evaluation on elk, moose, and caribou, with the possibility of reintroducing one or all of them back to the state. And it was determined at that point, because of a variety of factors, that elk were the animal that was most likely to succeed in an or in a reintroduction situation. So, but that whole thing kind of died off, and then in the early 1990s, there was more of a grassroots movement to bring elk back to the state. A handful of folks looked at the possibilities. They were kind of people in the right places with connections, but also they were university professors and Forest Service staff and things like that, and they started taking another look at it, and it started from the ground up rather than from the top down. And they built interest in it. They built local support, and pretty soon there were chapters of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation starting to form in the state, and everybody with the same thing in mind of trying to bring this wonderful, seeable, viewable big critter back on our Wisconsin landscape. And it's been quite successful, and that movement continues, and we continue to try to build the population. We've got lots of folks that like to go out and look for elk, and we've got the possibility on the horizon of having a hunting season for elk. It's wonderful for tourism and local economies. In the Clam Lake area alone, several years back, the Cable Visitors Bureau kind of took a look at things and determined that probably at that time, around $250,000 or so a year were coming in just to the small community of Clam Lake and the surrounding area for people wanting to come and look at elk. So, it's an ecological thing that belongs here historically, but yet, obviously lots of benefits to the human population out there to having them here.
I know one of the big parties initially in the mid-'90s was the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. What did you learn about their initial efforts and that research that went along with it, the reintroduction at that point that you were able to apply to when the DNR started to manage the population?
The elk reintroduction didn't actually start as a reintroduction. The reintroduction itself started as an experiment, and that's where the University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point, as well as Madison, played a role in that. They went out at that point, and the whole purpose of their study was really just to kind of see, could elk live here? Would they die off, or can they survive? And then as parts of that, what kind of habitat were they using and things like that. And I mean, the grand conclusion of it all, and the reason that the department eventually was given the responsibility to manage the population, was it was determined that yes, elk could survive here. By the time the department took, let's call it, possession of the herd or of the management responsibilities, I want to say there was about 60 or 65 animals on the landscape. So those first several years, the population showed very good growth. And, at that point, too, they were kind of becoming a loved part of the wildlife community in the state, and interest in them was growing. Nobody wanted to go out and remove the animals from the landscape at that point. So, like I said, the grand conclusion was, yes, they can live here. They've got everything that they need here to survive. They've got the food and the water, and all those things are kind of an interesting component of elk management in Wisconsin, because unlike western elk that might walk 10 or more miles in a single evening to find something to drink, Wisconsin elk, and it's common across the east, that they have all of the resources that they need, right there at their doorstep. So our elk don't travel very far. They're in a fairly small area within each of the elk ranges. And, that habitat use and things like that, we continue to look at that. So, the early research that was started in Stevens Point hasn't just ended. We continue, especially as we put more animals out on the ground through reintroduction efforts, to look at habitat use, to look at preferred areas where they're dropping their calves, the human side of things, where if they're getting into trouble. We've had some situations where elk have gone out into crop fields or cranberry bogs or whatever it may be. So the research has not ended, but like I said, the grand conclusion was, yes, we can have elk in Wisconsin and they can flourish here.
Has there ever been any pushback from the public or any political debates that had to be won to make this work here?
Yeah, like anything else, you're bringing a big deer into the landscape, and it's going to raise some concerns. So, We have worked with a variety of groups to try to, if there have been problems, to try to, settle those. We've had to go through, I guess we can call it, some of the politics before the animals even came here. One of the biggest issues before we brought elk to Wisconsin, both back in the 1990s and again here in the 2000s, was disease issues. Wisconsin is obviously a dairy state and a lot of cattle and milking cows here in the state. And nobody wanted to see, including us, any kind of a disease that would cause problems within our cattle herd. And, there are some common diseases, brucellosis and tuberculosis, that both elk and cattle can carry. So protocols were set up. Actually, some legislation had to be passed to allow us to bring elk into the state and set up the protocol as to how animals would be tested, how they would be quarantined, everything right down to the height of the fence and things like that had to be addressed before animals could come in. Where we got the elk from was very important to that whole conversation. So, that's one issue in itself. We have worked with various hunting groups, the cranberry growers. It was a very big concern that the wildlife damage abatement and claims program that many of the farmers in the state rely on to address bear damage or wolf damage or geese, deer, all of those things are included in that program. They wanted to make sure that elk were included in that in case there were some problems. So, there's a variety of fronts that we did our due diligence on, but again, that's always ongoing. We are always working with groups and keeping them informed, and, down the road here in the next year or two, we're going to be writing an entirely new elk management plan that takes into consideration all of the things that we've learned over the last 20 plus years here. We have not written a new elk management plan in that 20 years. So we're going to be doing that, and we will continue to address any kind of issues and how we will, make good final outcomes when it comes down to it.
How well do elk accommodate areas where they come into contact with human development, whether it's, that's cities or highways or businesses or, other development? How well do they handle that?
Well, the elk handle it pretty much just fine. The bigger problem comes in, or the bigger question is, how do the people handle it? We've had elk hit on the interstate. We've had a number of them hit by vehicles. We've had elk wander right through some fairly large city areas or on the fringes of them. It doesn't seem to bother the elk. It really comes down to how do the locals handle it, and if they're getting into any kind of trouble, those kind of situations are addressed. And we've got some farmers out there that they love to see the elk on their property. They don't necessarily like that they're maybe eating some of their corn or alfalfa, but at the same time, many of them are willing to sacrifice some of that because they see the greater good and they get their own personal enjoyment out of seeing elk on the landscape. So it kind of comes from lots of directions, and again, it's how the people handle it. The elk, as I said earlier, elk are extremely adaptable, and they will handle a variety of different kind of habitats.
What are some of in terms of growing the population and managing the population, what are some of the hurdles that the DNR has to overcome? You said they're pretty adaptable, but are there any issues that you guys face?
Well, yeah, there's lots of them, and it's, they're kind of common issues to the reintroduction of any sort of an animal. So, elk die from a variety of things, and, obviously the success of a reintroduction is going to be measured based on the number of animals that are eventually out there on the landscape. So, we've had success over the years increasing the wolf or the elk population, but and I'm getting to wolves, so that's why that slipped out there. Let's just jump into that. Predators are one of the things that we've addressed a lot. When we recently did some amendments to our elk management plan, there was discussion as to whether wolves, for example, or bears may be something that we would want to directly target as far as trying to increase the population. But, some of that research that we were talking about earlier, one of the things that we know for absolute certain is that elk don't do nearly as well. They don't survive as well in old forest. And, northern Wisconsin has a lot of big national forests, primarily in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, and lots of county land and things like that out there. And the habitat in those areas has aged over the years. The Chequamegon at one point was considered the hardest working national forest in the country. More board feet of lumber were coming out of northern Wisconsin than any place else in the country. And that was great for not only elk, but deer and grouse and a variety of other species out there that benefit from that young forest. And that has changed over the years. And there was a number of years in there where, for a variety of reasons, the Forest Service was not cutting timber at the same rate. And so over the years, that forest has grown and aged, and it has become less ideal habitat for elk and a variety of other wildlife. One of the things that we know is that young forests, and especially clear cuts, are great for elk, not only for hiding in and hiding their calves in, but by doing that, by providing that kind of habitat, it actually reduces predation. And we've got a number of examples of that in Wisconsin. So looking at the variety of ways that elk can die and trying to reduce those across the landscape has really been a big part of what we have done as far as actually managing the elk population. Another one of the biggest ways that elk have died in Wisconsin is being hit by vehicles. We've taken steps over the years, especially up in the Clam Lake area, where, we've worked with local landowners who may have been feeding the elk in their backyard and the elk are crossing the highway to get there or whatever it might be, trying to work with them to reduce that, if not eliminate it altogether. So I think we've had good success over the years of doing that. And, like I said, the population has continued to grow, but one of the things that we really can't control in Wisconsin or anywhere else is the weather. And in the couple of years where we have not seen positive growth in the population have been very severe winters. So just a few years ago, when we had the winter of 2013 and 14, we had over 200 inches of what we call winter severity index days in northern Wisconsin. That was the worst winter that we've ever had. And the elk population took a hit from that. So there are things we can control and things that we can't control. But in the long run, if the population continues to grow, you have to consider it a success.
Is there a number in mind that you have as far as you want to get to for a sustainable population?
Yeah, our elk population, for a sustainable population, we have a sustainable population right now. I mean, our elk population has been over 22 years, and it continues to grow. But we have, overall herd size goals within our elk management plans. And currently, those goals in the Jackson County herd are about 390, and in the Clam Lake herd, it's 1,400. So, like I said earlier, we've seen some of the problems you see in any population that's reintroduced. You typically start out with fairly slow growth, and then at some point you're going to get over a hump where growth is going to take off, and you're going to see a lot more animals out there on the landscape. And we fully anticipate that that's going to happen with our elk, but some of those challenges that I just talked about, have slowed that down a fair bit, but we fully expect that at some point we are going to get to that 1,400 animals up in the Clam Lake area, and even long before that occurs, we can have a sustainable hunting season. It may be very, very limited, but you're losing animals every single year. Your population doesn't just take off and continue to grow. You do lose animals on an annual basis, but we are going to get to a point here. The number that we have in mind right now is 200 total animals in the Clam Lake area, and once we reach that point, we will be able to have at least a limited sustainable hunt in the long term.
I imagine there are hunts. You can go on a hunt for elk elsewhere in the United States. Is there anything that you're paying attention to, or you've had conversations with other states or other areas where there are hunts available?
No, not really. I mean, I'm an elk hunter myself. In fact, I used to work for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation as well. So I've talked to hundreds and thousands of elk hunters in my life and other organizations. But, like I said, it really comes down to whether your population can continue to grow and sustain that hunt. Once you get to a certain number, if your growth rate remains fairly steady over the long-term average, Ours right now is about 7 to 8%. We could hold a limited hunting season probably right now. You're going to replace that loss with recruitment every year. So new calves are going to be out there on the landscape and replacing those animals that have died. Our magic number at the moment is 200, and as the population continues to grow over the years, we can continue to add more hunting opportunity through limited permits.
How many years away do you think we are from a hunt, and what would that take? Would it take an act of the state legislature to make that happen?
Our hunt is already authorized. So all the rules were written many years ago to allow a hunt to take place in Wisconsin. But the one rule that we do have to follow at the moment is that it is in rule that we have to have 200 animals on the landscape before we can hold a hunt. But once we hit that point, which I would, hopefully is going to be here in the next couple of years, we would be ready to initiate a hunt. So we're looking forward to that day. And, we're not looking forward to it from the standpoint of, oh boy, we get to go out and shoot elk now. We're looking forward to it because there's a group of naysayers out there in the world, and there always is. And, they don't consider this a valid effort. The reintroduction is not going to be fully validated to them until we actually have a hunting season. It may sound like kind of an odd way of looking at it, but I think that's, kind of a high watermark for a lot of people, that when you can see the opportunity to hold a hunt, it brings it to a whole nother level of success for them. From that standpoint, we kind of look forward to when that day actually happens.
I'm kind of curious about how this actually happens, of getting where you get the elk from and how you bring them to the state. Can you kind of run down a little bit of the process, of the nuts and bolts of how you capture them, you transport them, and then release? It's a large animal, so can you kind of walk me through the process of doing that?
Our effort right now is taking place in the state of Kentucky. Just getting to those elk and maneuvering around that country is kind of a challenge in itself, because you're working on a lot of mine-type sites in eastern Kentucky coal fields. So you're going up and down mountains, and you're hauling trailers with these big traps on them. Our elk traps are panels, so they're basically about a 10 by 10 foot panel that we connect all of these panels into a circle, and they have a trap door kind of a thing on them. And, the door is on a weighted system, and we have various methods of triggering those traps so that when the elk go in, the elk either trigger the trap themselves, or we can have somebody sitting off a distance watching the trap, and they can trigger it. But before the trap ever gets set, our crews go out and they scout the area. They get landowner permission if that's necessary. A lot of this is taking place on private property in eastern Kentucky. And they go get that permission, and they start baiting the site. And when the animals start hitting that site on a regular basis, the crews will go in and set the trap up, and then it's pretty much just a waiting game. You can get elk the same day, and sometimes it might take a week or more for those animals to actually come back through the area or get used to the trap. Weather plays a big role in it. If it's warm and rainy out, they don't need nearly as much food as they would if it was extremely cold. So the conditions can actually make it fairly challenging in capturing those elk. And then when it comes right down to it, they may walk into the trap or they may not. It's completely up to them. We had a situation our first year down there. I want to say there was something like 60 elk standing right outside the pen, and not a single one of them went in, or to the trap, I should say. Not one of them went in. So you're kind of sitting on a hillside watching this happen and pulling your hair out, wishing something would happen, but it's up to them. So it's a waiting game. Then when you finally do get elk in the trap, our crews again move in. We have kind of trailers that have been specially modified to do the job that we need them to do. And the traps are set up in a way that there's kind of an inner door and an outer door, so we can back the trailer into that outer door and then open up the inner door, and we flush the animals into the trap, or into the trailer, I should say. And typically they go in there, fairly easily, fairly calm, and we get the door shut behind them. And then we haul them, however distance it may be. Some areas of eastern Kentucky, we had to haul the animals as much as 2 hours to get them to our quarantine pen. And the animals get to the pen, and we work them up. We put a tag number in their ear so that we can identify individual animals. They get weighed. Eventually, they get radio collared, but we do a variety of health testing on the animals after they're in quarantine. So when we are completely done trapping and the last animal goes into the quarantine facility, the clock starts. And after 30 days, we test them for a variety of diseases, as I mentioned before, to make sure we're not bringing those back to Wisconsin. And then once they clear that initial testing, we can haul them to Wisconsin, where we put them into another acclimation pen. So grand total, they spend at least 120 days in quarantine during all the health testing. And part of the purpose of having them in that pen once they get to Wisconsin is to acclimate them to the area. Research shows that when you haul an animal a great distance like that, rather than just turning it loose on the landscape, if you do that, it's likely to end up who knows where. Whereas if you bring them to the area and you hold them for an extended period of time, they're more likely to home in on that area, and they will stay put. That's part of what we're doing as well. And while they're in quarantine, at various stages of that quarantine, we're conducting the health tests that we are required by the Department of Agriculture to conduct on the animals. If they fail those tests, there's a possibility that we would have to put down the entire herd, which thankfully has never happened before. In quarantine, we're dealing with a variety of animal health issues and monitoring. There's somebody at that pen site 24 hours a day, and every single day those animals are getting fed and they're getting monitored. Somebody sits and watches each one of those individual animals come to eat every day. We look for any kind of health concerns or broken limbs or whether they've had their calf. All of those kind of things are observed every single day. And then at some point, we get past all of that. We do the final health checks on them. We put GPS radio tracking collars on the animals, and we turn them loose. And when we turn them loose, it's not a big kind of a drum roll stampede out the door sort of an event. Pretty much just go to the pen site, remove those doors, and we walk away, and the animals come out at their leisure, when they're feeling comfortable to walk on out. That's kind of it in a nutshell. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of fun. It requires lots of people and lots of moving parts and a lot of equipment and that kind of thing. So, it's kind of a prepare for Normandy invasion sort of an event for us. A lot of folks involved on this end, putting staff together and getting trucks lined up and trailers and all of those kind of things. So a lot of moving parts.
I imagine through the whole process, you spend a lot of time just around the animal, which is not something that would be normal for most people. Do you have any observations of just spending time around them, just watching them, or that things that you wouldn't maybe know if you didn't have that much time to spend around them?
Well, some of the more interesting stuff that we see, we really kind of tend to see once they're released, and we're not actually seeing the animal itself, but we're seeing the movements of the animals through these GPS collars. So, the collars themselves, we get 2 signals every single day, and we don't have to go out on the landscape to do this anymore. We don't have to chase elk with radio antennas and that kind of thing like we did so much in the past. We still do some of that, but for the most part, we get signals right to our computers. Some of the movement that the animals have happened, and I'll give you an interesting one that I thought was pretty interesting that occurred this fall. We released elk in Jackson County a few years ago now, and in the summertime, we've had a few of the bulls that have left the area of release, and they found their own kind of home range in some surrounding counties. And this year, so each year when the rut kicks back in, those animals have come right back to the pen. They remember where the girls were, and they come back to those locations, and they come and do what elk do in the fall, and that's to look for mates. So those animals have come back, and this year I thought was particularly interesting situation because we had 2 elk that were quite a number of miles apart. They were not spending their summer months together. But on the very same day, and it just happened to be the day of the eclipse last fall, on the very same day, both of those animals left their summer haunts, and both of them went right back to the release pen. Now, What triggers something like that? I have no idea. I mean, I have a little bit of an idea. Certainly it's got something to do with daylight, but the coincidence of it to both happen on the same day and, to both, that day happen to be the eclipse, I thought that was pretty doggone interesting.
Yeah.
But, we are watching animals on a daily basis, and it's really fun to, over the long term, to, witness how they are as a mother, how they interact with other animals. You see a hierarchy formed within the herd, and there are clear leaders and there are clear followers. It's all really interesting to, obviously we've witnessed the calves being born. We've witnessed, how those mothers take care of that calf or not. You may have a situation where you have a mother that, we usually refer to them as a poor doer. So that's usually a young cow that just has no idea what to do with this little critter that just fell out of her body. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily turn out really well for the calf itself. But, those interactions, they're a very social animal. They're a herd animal. And to see that hierarchy and the interaction between the cows and the bulls, or, the bulls among themselves or the cows among themselves, the playfulness of the calves, it's all fascinating. It's all entertaining. It's not necessarily unique to elk, but because of the social nature of the animals, I think, that kind of stuff is probably easier to observe than it normally would be.
You tag them and you give them numbers, I'm guessing, but you also give them names, or do you kind of have like a familiar relationship with like certain elk that you track a lot, or
No, we don't name them. They're not pets.
Right.
These are wild animals, and the only reason that they're getting a name is so that we can conduct the research. Getting a number. We can conduct the research. We can say cow 624, move 14 miles overnight, and, we're watching her for whatever reason, or we're watching her because we think she's about to drop a calf, and we may want to go in and try to find that calf. Like I said before, they get that number right from the very start because we have to be able to track individual animals through the health process. So we put a unique ear tag in each one of those animals so that number 624, we know that when she came in, she weighed 485 pounds, and she may have been treated for something, and we need to be able to track all of that treatment. We need to be able to track blood samples and all those kind of things through it. So having said that, though, the guys that are out there on the ground and are most familiar with these animals because they are the ones that are living in the area as our local elk biologists, they're tracking the animals, they're monitoring them for whatever it may be for habitat use or whatnot. They do get some real familiarity with them. It's always interesting when we are able, track back and we have an animal that we know, for example, was one of the first animals brought to the state. I think in the last year or so, we finally lost the last original Michigan elk that came to Wisconsin. We were able to track that animal through all those years. It's fun because we will know that calf number 724 was born to cow number 618, and we can kind of track the family history of that animal through time. And, certainly the thing that people recognize the most out there are the antlers on the big bulls, and those are the ones that the locals really kind of glom on. But again, it's fun to know which one of those animals, is the dominant animal, and he had all the cows last year, and he had all the cows this year, and, just to kind of track them through the social structure of it as well.
No, I know earlier in July 2017, the DNR released 31 elk in northern Wisconsin. How did that release fare this year? That
was the last release that we did. So those animals are, again, there's some more of the interesting stuff that we can track with the use of those radio collars. For the most part, those animals have done very, very well. We did lose a few of them to predation or vehicle collisions or whatever it might have been. You can't expect that you're going to go through a year with 100% survival. It doesn't happen naturally in nature, and it certainly isn't going to happen in a reintroduction. So we did lose a few, but part of the reason that we wanted to bring animals to the Clam Lake area where the original herd was, we're supplementing those numbers with these Kentucky elk, and part of our goal was to intermingle new genetics within the population. Wisconsin's original herd started from animals that were donated in the state of Michigan. We started with 25 animals, and that entire herd over in Michigan was started with only 7 animals. So, they're not seeing any kind of genetic problems, but that's certainly something we want to make sure we don't see in the future. So we wanted to bring some new genetics into the population, and we are seeing that genetic mix already this year. So we released animals last summer, and when the rut started to come around in late August and into September, we know for sure that several of the Kentucky cows that were here were tended by a big Wisconsin bull all fall long. We had another one of the cows that went out on a walkabout, and she ended up about 35 miles to the north of where we released her down in the Flambeau River State Forest. But somehow she found her way to the north to the original Clam Lake herd, and she is currently spending time with about 15 elk up in that area, and we know that she also was tended by a bull this fall. So we're already seeing that intermix going on, and that was one of our main goals of the project. So we're very, very happy to see that going on. Another good part of the whole thing is that the elk, for the most part, have tended to stay put. As I said earlier, our elk tend to not travel too far, but every once in a while we'll get a flyer out there that kind of takes off, and for whatever reason, we don't know if it got chased. We don't know if it has some other issue going on, an illness that might make it go wander around away from the rest of the population. But for the most part, those elk are staying put, and they are where we want them to be, and they're intermixing with elk that were already here in Wisconsin. So it's all positive. It's all good stuff.
You mentioned earlier that I think you said that Minnesota was considering a reintroduction or was possibly in the process of it. Do you have any hopes for cooperating with Minnesota and having populations intermingle between the two states?
Well, we're a long way from that possibility. I haven't really given that a whole lot of thought. It's very unlikely, though, that Minnesota would be able to bring animals from Wisconsin to their state as part of their reintroduction effort like we are doing with Kentucky. And a big reason for that is because of the chronic wasting disease situation in Wisconsin. Our biggest reason for going to Kentucky, other than that they were great, willing partners with an abundance of elk, but one of the requirements of all of this is that animals must come from a low-risk CWD area. And all of that is determined through surveillance. So, Kentucky since the early 2000s has been testing for chronic wasting disease in their state. I know that total number of animals that they have tested up to this point is something over 25,000. And chronic wasting disease has never been detected in the state. So when it comes to interstate transport, taking those animals across state lines, getting the health certificates and everything that are required to do that, chronic wasting disease plays a very big role in that. So they would not come to Wisconsin looking for elk. Getting back, a little closer to some of what you asked in your question, if there was, interstate back and forth, if there was ever a point where their animals were that close to the line and ours were that close to the line, I don't know, it's kind of hard to answer that question right now, but I don't know that if the populations were that large, they're going to do what they're going to do. We already know that we've got deer and other animals that wander back and forth across state lines, so it's certainly possible with elk. But then on the other hand, where Wisconsin's elk ranges are areas where we really kind of want to keep the elk, and those are not really near the Minnesota border at all. So when we get an animal that's well outside of our elk ranges, we look at the possibility of trapping that animal and bringing it back in. As a matter of fact, we just recently did that. We had one of the Jackson County animals went for quite a long walk, and she ended up in Dunn County. And for a time there, it looked like she may end up in Minnesota. She was kind of headed in that direction, but she eventually turned and found an area where she settled. And we recently went into that area and trapped that cow and brought her back to the Jackson County area. So we're hoping that by doing so, she'll reacclimate to the area and stay put this time. So there's an effort on our part to keep the elk in a certain area and not let them just wander wherever they might want to go.
Why did you get into working in this field?
Well, like a lot of people in the field, I am a hunter and a fisherman, and it's not, those aren't just things that I go and do. Those are things that kind of define who I am and where my interests fall in this world. Like a lot of other wildlife biologists, I've had a fascination with animals my whole life. That led me to an interest in pursuing a career in wildlife management. As I said, I am a ardent hunter myself, and my focus for many years is in big game of all types. And I got real lucky. One of my first jobs out of college was working for the Department of Natural Resources in the deer management program, and that happened to overlap when we were bringing elk to Wisconsin in the mid-1990s, and that turned into a job working for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. So I've had a love for elk for a long, long time. It's kind of ironic how things take a big circle and come back around. And about 6 years ago, I got the opportunity and the offer to run Wisconsin's deer and elk program, and a big incentive for me to want to do that. Because as I think you probably know, it's not one of the funnest jobs in the state when it comes especially to deer management. Lots of different opinions and a lot of challenges out there. But the biggest incentive and carrot dangled in front of my nose was that there was a good possibility that elk were back on the horizon for a reintroduction. Thankfully, I was able to slide into that position, and we were able to start making things really click. And pretty soon, boom, we were right into an agreement with Kentucky, and here we are, starting to look at the tail end of a reintroduction. So it's been a great ride. It's a roller coaster. It's a lot of frustration, but it's a lot of gratification and successes as well. And you take the good with the bad, and you keep your eye on that end prize of getting the reintroduction done and having that strong, viable, long-term population out there. So it's been fun, and while it's had its frustrations, I've loved every minute of it.
So this is something that you would very much take pride in, the fact that having an elk population that's sustainable. It's kind of like a legacy thing. I mean, this could hopefully live on for a long time after you're done working for the DNR.
Yeah, the elk reintroduction isn't about Kevin Wallenfang, but when you look back at it, it's one of the greatest things in my career that I've ever had the opportunity to work on. Gratifying work, and everybody wants to leave their mark on the landscape, I guess, and I've been lucky enough to do that. When I worked for the Elk Foundation, I worked raising a lot of money for elk projects throughout the country, but then I moved into another position that was protecting land, doing conservation easements and land acquisitions, and much of that occurred in northern Wisconsin. And, to look back and know that there's property out there that is open for public use in perpetuity because of the work that you did, and now elk actually walking around on them, I think that's one of the greatest gifts you can give to the rest of the state, and one of the greatest things that can be given to you personally is to look back and know that there's something out there on the landscape that people are enjoying that you played a big part of putting out there. So it's been great. I can't imagine that I'll ever have an opportunity to do something as meaningful as what I'm doing right now, but who knows? Who knows what's down the road?
So elk have been around in Wisconsin for about 20 years. Where would you like to see the next 20 years? 20 years from now, where would you like to see the elk in Wisconsin?
Well, I certainly want to see that population continue to grow. Within the next 20 years, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that in the Jackson County area that we would be closing in on our overall population goals. I think that's probably going to be a little more difficult in the northern part of the state, but we've still got a lot of work to do as far as reintroduction goes, and the more animals that we can bring in on the front end, the more likely we are to reach those goals. But certainly I would like to see us getting close to those maximum populations. I would love to see other counties want to have elk, and that's going to be part of our elk management plan rewrite, is that we are reaching out to other areas of the state. So, it would be wonderful if we can get to a point where elk are widely accepted, and I think that we're heading in that direction as other communities see the benefits of having elk there. I think that the interest is going to grow. I would certainly like to see elk become a major component of a tourism industry of its own in Wisconsin. or at least certainly helping local communities where elk exist, because that was one of our main goals of putting them here, is making them available and viewable from a big game perspective and from a hunting perspective. I very much would like to see at some point a hunting season take place. Like I said, for a lot of folks, that's going to kind of eventually validate all of the work that's been put into this, and I mean blood, sweat, and tears by a lot of really good people. But I would like to see that hunting season happen sooner rather than later. And they are a spectacular big game animal, and just to get out and listen to them and see them is great, and I want people to enjoy that too.
Thanks to Kevin for taking the time. He noted that if you're interested, there's plenty of ways you can volunteer to help the elk reintroduction effort if you poke around the DNR's website. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. If you're liking the show, please rate or review the show on your podcast service. It goes a long way in helping new listeners find the show. Also, you can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.
By